Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Welcome back. My guest today knows France, its history, its intellectual tradition, and its actually current politics far better than I do. And that comes through really clearly in a piece he wrote for the American Mind titled We Need Friends, Not Flatterers, which looks at the Franco-American alliance in the wake of Davos and Munich. And in this piece, which I think is really worth reading, he asks what it really means for two proud republics to be honest partners rather than two convenient ones. So Luke Foster is an assistant professor of government at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, and he's the co-founder of Academia Tocqueville, an intensive annual seminar in Paris dedicated to introducing Americans to the tradition of French political thought. So welcome, Luke.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So before we start, I want to ask you a little bit about you. So you and I met at a conference, at a Liberty Fund conference. And one of the things that was really striking to me is how much you know about France. And so I'm actually curious, can you tell us a little bit about you and how you got to do the kind of work you do and what was your intellectual evolution, if you will?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So I suppose I should say, to begin with, I'm an assistant professor of government at the Hillsdale College DC campus, which means most of my day-to-day teaching responsibilities are in political philosophy or political theory. But our program is designed to prepare and form public servants, in the loftiest formulation, statesmen who can really address the needs of the country. And so all of our students are working professionals in some form in public life here in DC. And that means, we need to give them a solid philosophical foundation or sort of high philosophical horizons. We need to give them historical context and understanding of the American constitutional order and where it comes from, what its evolution has been. But it also means we need to, I think, to do that well, we need to give them a view of foreign affairs and America's position in the world and our allies and our enemies, and how to think through those things in light of the larger philosophical and historical context.
Was it always an interest of yours?
Yes. So to get to how I personally came to care about the French stuff, I suppose I should say I grew up overseas. I grew up in a missionary family, actually, in Mozambique, so southeastern part of Africa, which is not directly pertinent, but it certainly helped form me to be curious about, interested in languages and cultures and the way in which seeing something from the outside can be a helpful, valuable perspective to bring and give you sympathy and depth. And then for me personally, I'd always, I think maybe, in college as an early graduate student, I had the sort of maybe typical American conservatives, slight interest in France, slight distrust of France. The memes of the 35-hour work week and the flames in the banlieue in 2005, and a sense that this is a society either doomed to anarchic, total distrust of all authority, or the heavy hand of the state clamping down, regulating everything. That was sort of my impression. And it's, of course, not totally wrong, like most cliches, but I got more curious through my study of Tocqueville, which is really my academic expertise, a big part of my research and my writing. And I wanted to know, who was this man? How could he be so profound and so far-seeing in his view of America? And it turns out in large part it's because he lived through the 19th century in France, and he saw a terrible succession of regimes, sort of the attempt to, he's sympathetic to trying to follow the British parliamentary tradition, but it doesn't exist in France. And so it seemed to me you had to go back further to see a deeper grounding for order and continuity in the modern world. So I also got interested in Montesquieu, right? In many ways, one of the great fathers of liberalism in the 18th century. Got to studying the American Revolution versus the French Revolution. Parallel time frames, similar rhetoric, but very different outcomes,
Very
and
different.
ultimately, I think a very different philosophy behind them. And I got very sympathetic, also or interested in the critique of the revolution from the French side. Right? How did French intellectuals themselves think about where it went wrong? So that's the intellectual background. And then I spent a year and a half really as part of my graduate studies as a fellow at Sciences Po in Paris. The University of Chicago sent me there as one of their fellows, and that was really intense immersion linguistically and culturally, because it was during the COVID period
Hmm.
when the country was
Yeah.
mostly in lockdown. Very few foreigners were allowed in. Very few English speakers were around, even in a big city like Paris. So I had to spend time with French people. I had to learn French through many embarrassing mistakes. I saw a very different relationship again to the state and public authority, emergency powers. You had to issue a little police form every time you left your
Yeah.
apartment to walk your dog. Uh,
And it was no joke. It was
no
like
joke at all. No,
no joke at all. At the
and
same time, they
and very
opened.
centralized, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
One policy for the whole country.
Yeah. At the same time, they opened the schools way sooner than we did.
Yes, yes. So in certain ways, I was very. I mean, we can go into this if you like, but I was very distressed, I think, by especially living in Chicago right before what I saw of the American response. And there were certain advantages to seeing, the president go on national television and issue an overarching policy to get the whole country out of the crisis, right? So I gained an appreciation also for the Fifth Republic's presidential structure, even though it's grim in some ways.
It really took it just really to a whole other level. But I have always thought it was kind of interesting. So, I mean, I share, even though I'm French and I grew up in France, I share a lot of the cliche belief about France, because that's just growing up in this country, being libertarian and being just in a world where literally no one thought like me, no one questioned the government, right? I
Yeah.
tended to be very biased and basically seeing mostly that side of the country. Now I
Yeah.
see other things, like I mean, I do kind of recognize, for instance, on zoning, in a weird way, the French are way better than the
Yes.
Americans. Like, I mean, just significantly better. It's like, it's not just like in cities like Paris. Yes, they are very, very strict about what you can do with the facade of a building, but what's behind, they're like completely, they allow mixed use. They have built way more than we have. I mean, they're
Paris is
just,
still one of the densest cities in the Western world,
yeah,
and it has been since the High Middle Ages.
yeah. So
And
it's,
Paris is actually incredible example of urban design that's
yeah,
very successful
yeah,
and very human, very usable.
exactly. So it's like, it's interesting kind of now. Like I see things in a more subtle way. I don't want to go to France. It's just not a model for me. But, even though kind of like, we'll see what goes on in America, they become,
Yeah.
because I actually don't think that the European model can sustain something that is so top down as the French way. But
Yes. Well, I mean, there are, and perhaps when we get to talking about the piece, we can go into this in more detail, but there are, I think, real questions as to if and when the European countries have to really assume self-government responsibility for their own defense, what pressure that will put on the fiscal model, and whether some of the, I think, irresponsibility of recent decades is actually due to the American security umbrella in paradoxical ways. But maybe just to say one last thing about my own parcours, as the French say, my trajectory to get to this point. So the time in France really marked me and it's very formative, and I've retained many close friendships and ties to associations there. And then when I moved back in 2022 and finished my PhD and started an academic career, I helped found this program called Academia Tocqueville, which is an annual summer seminar designed to bring mostly but not exclusively aspiring intellectual Americans, often graduate students, professionals, to Paris for 2 weeks in the summer to really do immersive study in the tradition of French political thought. Often putting them in front of texts they wouldn't otherwise have a chance to study, putting them in front of scholars and speakers with real command in the French tradition, who they wouldn't otherwise get to meet. People like Pierre Manon and Chantal Delsol, often people from an older generation whose work hasn't really been conveyed to the English-speaking world very well. So that for me, that's, it's a small nonprofit now that I help run, and it's one of my side projects, but it's something very dear to me, and I really hope to see grow in coming years. So this is an ongoing commitment of mine. It's not a mere hobby.
So I have a question actually about the Tocqueville and the Franco-American intellectual tradition. So how, in your opinion, Tocqueville's observation about American democracy, how does it hold up today? But the other one, I guess, would be, how did it shape the French liberal thought at the time? Or does that intellectual debt still flows both ways today? Or
Yeah. Both excellent questions. And I've wanted to, for some years now, to design a graduate seminar on readings of Tocqueville over the years and how the reception has changed. I would say what you will hear from many kind of left of center authorities on Tocqueville is that as a book on America, its fundamental claim that American society and socioeconomic life is marked by the equality of conditions may have been true with the significant exception of slavery at the time in the 1830s when he visited, but is no longer true, right? Because he's marked by a world of broad land ownership, right? The availability of Western land. He's very attentive to the lack of primogeniture in America, the way in which family estates are not passed down to the eldest son, but are instead parceled out among all the children, which tends to diffuse property over generations. And many would say that, that may have been true to an extent then, that led to the New England town meeting and possibilities of local self-government, et cetera, which he praises. But if you look at the post-industrial and especially highly financialized American economy today, that doesn't hold up because of the way essentially that large firms concentrate capital and return on investment. So there's often from the left a respect for Tocqueville, but a kind of distrust of his empirics, if you will. And part of this is that Tocqueville he's a great social scientist and maybe one of the first, but he's not a contemporary social scientist, and that he doesn't show you his data. He actually did a lot of interesting archival research, but Democracy in America is mostly qualitative in its language and analysis.
So can we actually kind of highlight very quickly what are the main claims that Tocqueville makes about his observation in America? Because we know the kind of the community, civil society aspect of America that he's very impressed with, right? Civil society is just basically an essential pillar to explaining the culture, but also there's just kind of how the country works. That's one.
Certainly. That's very important. Yeah. So one thing I would add about that is, and this is often, I think, underappreciated by American scholarship on Tocqueville, he views civil society as the substitute for the aristocracy. So the understanding of French history he has, which is coming out of people like François Guizot, his teacher at the Sorbonne, who's also a great influence on the French liberal tradition, is that central power always needs to be contested. Otherwise, it will grow. And so the image is that in medieval and early modern France, what you had was the forms of contestation was primarily the aristocracy, which is very literal, right? The royal army can't do very much if they depend on local nobles to recruit their troops. And those local nobles have their own fortified houses, their own castles, which they can retreat into.
Yeah. And they also have to give their first son and their...
Yes.
Yeah.
So royal authority is actually quite checked and balanced in a certain, not in a constitutional formal way, but through the diffusion of social and economic power. And Tocqueville says, of course, you're not going to have that same thing in modernity, right? Now that there are cannons, the castle walls don't matter as much. And now that there's a state with the fiscal sophistication to tax differently, this is really shows up in his Old Regime and the Revolution book, his book on French history. The old regime was very inefficient at taxing, but modern states can reach into your pocketbook much more profoundly. Actually, the tax burden is much higher. So how are you going to get forces that can align and form coalitions to contest central power? Well, it's going to be through associations. So the praise of townships, and it's not just a sort of romantic, nostalgic, wasn't the Rotary Club nice in the 1950s, which I think we have a tendency to hear it that way in America. It's actually saying, no, the fact that ordinary citizens can pool their money and their talents to solve a problem, to take care of the homeless, to build a hospital, to start a college and educate their own people. These things keep the state from becoming the sole pillar in which everybody relies. And so that's where I think if you read it that way, the civil society analysis gets very profound.
Yes, it
And
is
then what I would
profound.
say is,
And it seems to me then that it's held up pretty well in America. I mean, it's obviously not what it used to be,
yes,
but in very significant ways, it has held up well.
yes. And here's an area where I don't know the statistics as well as you or many of your listeners, I'm sure, but the percentage of GDP in America that goes to philanthropy and private charity is larger than any other OECD country by several times, I believe.
And in a way, it is also the product of the fact that the central government is so much bigger in France and has taken on, basically crowding out the job of taking care of people. I believe in France, a third of their GDP, which is significantly lower than ours per capita, and is actually going to welfare. It's an enormous amount. And as a result, people are poorer in many ways. And I mean, it's like I'm always shocked about how income per capita is significantly lower. I mean, it's like, I think last time I checked, that was like 2 years ago. So it was like something like $44,000 in France, and it was like 79 something in the US. It was like a significant gap. But what it means is like, one, the state is sending the signal that it's doing this, and so you don't need to do it. But also you're poor, so you have less money to actually to devote to these type of things, especially in a country where the practice of religion has gone down quite dramatically, and a lot of the civil society expressed itself, not exclusively, but a lot through the church.
Certainly, yes. And so that's another huge piece of the story, which is that in the old French estates, the three elements of society fundamentally, right, are not just the nobility and the commoners, but the church, right, the first estate, in fact. And part of the reason why the Ancien Regime gave such a significant political voice to the church is actually that it ran medicine, education, welfare, right? What we now think of as public state functions were very often church functions. And so again, Tocqueville sees in a strange way, the American system is actually a more of a healthy outgrowth of the quite rich and varied landscape of medieval society with multiple states. The dynamism of American religion is part of the vitality of American society, which also keeps the state from becoming omnipotent. I will say, just on the GDP numbers, the contrast doesn't always address everything, because
I agree.
The standard of public services is higher, I think, in France.
Yeah.
And there are certain kinds of just built up accumulated wealth, like the beauty and efficiency of central Paris, that very few American cities can compete with, right? Which is hard to track.
I totally.
There are certain quality of life things which do compare favorably,
and they're like the French have actually kind of accumulated and built significant amount of wealth that then they're deciding to squander or to spend down on all of these services now it has a real cause. The other thing that, by the way, the French have done significantly better than other countries, especially in Europe, but also in the U.S., is actually on energy. And
Yes.
like, while it's actually it's gone the wrong way the last decade or so. I mean, we cannot overstate the impact that the enormous investment and commitment to nuclear energy is actually provided to the country.
I believe, again, I should check the latest statistics, but something like 70% of the French grid is directly
Yeah.
nuclear powered.
Was it's a little less now because stupidly they have decided, when it was popular to actually said, no, we're just gonna rely on solar and
Yeah.
and wind.
Some of it, though, even some of the renewables are things like tidal plants in Brittany using some of the rapid tides in the Bay of Biscay. Some of it, it's even the renewable stuff is often better thought through than
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like the thing where I have to say, uh, with age, with a little bit kind of more of a willingness to actually kind of look at things that, you know, just doesn't fit exactly my ideology. Like looking at kind of France has like on the design front and the kind of thinking of some of these issues is actually remarkably good.
yes, yes. And so, I mean, there, if you permit me a digression, you see an interesting legacy of Gaullism, right?
Yeah.
The thought, the thinking, and the work of Charles de Gaulle, first general and then president. It's easy to gloss it, I think, from the English speaking world. We say, oh, it's about a strong state. It's about, it's a right wing version of a strong state. But de Gaulle was very clear always that what he saw the state as doing was assuming the pouvoir régalien is the term in French law, right? The royal powers, really, which meant it's just picking up on, again, the old French monarchy, the idea that the, you should have a efficient, decisive central
Yeah.
authority, but it shouldn't try to do everything. It should limit itself to things that are clearly about the long-term public interest.
Also, where does this fit with the Gaullist tradition of strategic autonomy?
Very closely linked, right? So the
Okay.
idea is the regalian powers are about the defense of the realm externally, it's peace internally, and it's long-term needs, right?
Yeah.
But it's not about minute economic regulation. It's not about welfare spending necessarily. The Liberty Fund colloquium where we met was about Jacques Rueff, the major economic advisor to de Gaulle, he's a classical liberal in a sense. He's actually very opposed to redistribution or deficit spending, but not opposed to provision of public goods,
Yeah, and
right?
that's
And so,
that's
and one of the key public goods is the capacity to not be dependent on hostile foreign powers in the event of a crisis, and the ability to act on your own if need be.
so this is actually so first a comment, which is one of the things that I have actually come to realize in a way is like, I mean, the American government is so inefficient, like compared to the French government. Now, the French government is massively distortive because it does all that welfare stuff and but on the delivery of public good, even they have a definition that is way bigger than mine of what a public good does. But for some of the stuff, the French government actually does like much better thing in terms of, improper payment. Like they would never tolerate the scale of improper payment. And that is because built into the system, this machine is was always built with in mind the kind of check to make sure that you don't send the money the wrong way. And it's like things like this that I've come to realize. Now, this is not the case. The government is way too big, but but it is kind of interesting to me that, and I don't know whether this is actually what you need to grow the government to that extent, is to actually do some things well, but it's also unbelievably striking about how inefficient the American government is.
Yes. Yes, in a certain way, it's actually the contrast is a deeper rebuke to American public spending, because you realize that we don't make civil servant work prestigious.
Yeah.
And so often the quality of person attracted to public sector jobs in America is someone who couldn't keep up in the private sector.
Yeah.
But in a way, the French system is inverted. I mean, it's changing now because I think all these things have gotten worse. But the historical trajectory is the best schools, the equivalent, the grande école, the equivalent of, sort of the Ivy League, which are public institutions, are training high functionaries for civil service, and so the salaries are pretty good, not quite on par with big companies, but not bad. And then the prestige of being able to say, I'm part of, say, the National Fiscal Service, is a big deal. And I will say this translates down to sort of small areas of everyday life. I mean, my taxes are not that complicated. In America, it takes me 2 weeks of stress every year, and a subscription to TurboTax, right? Which, these middlemen companies, which are meant to simplify it for you, et cetera. In France, when I pay taxes as a foreign worker, I wasn't quite sure exactly how the tax treaty applied between the two countries. I called the National Fiscal Service in 20 minutes on the phone with a very, very friendly professional person. Everything was dealt with, and it was a pleasant experience.
Yeah.
Which there is no equivalent. I mean, you can't talk to the IRS if you wanted to, and if you did, it would be a nightmare.
I've had to request a birth certificate several times in France because, I mean, the problem is, first it was a really remarkably smooth, easy experience online. You don't talk to anyone and you get your stuff. The problem is like your birth certificate is only valid for 3 months, which makes no sense whatsoever. But it is true that actually a lot of that stuff, the experience is slightly better. But I want to actually transition on one thing where I think really things have changed quite dramatically, though. This is like the ideal. And because basically the government has grown so much in France, that is actually polluting the stuff that the government should be doing well, these public goods so well.
Yeah.
And in particular, like when you think about the delivery of defense, right, should be like an area where that is kind of like the quintessential role of the government or central government is the provision of defense. And yet here we are in a situation where actually the French government is most invested in defense than more the other European countries. And still it is so much behind. And also now this is where it ties to the relationship with the US and how this underinvestment in NATO, the just basically free riding for all of these years on the back of Americans. How did we get there?
Certainly, yeah. It's a very complicated story, and this is part of what the recent essay I did in The American Mind, which I titled "We Need Friends, Not Flatterers."
Yeah. So
about, right, which is a kind of charitable reconstruction, I think, of what the Trump administration is trying to do with regard to NATO rebalancing, and particularly with regard to the French element.
So for listener, this is a really great, interesting article. It's in The American Mind, and it was published on the 23rd of February. It's called "We Need Friends, Not Flatterers." And it's about the Franco-American alliance after Davos and the recent Munich speech by Marco Rubio. So first, let's set the stage. How do we get to a situation where basically like all of Europe has been totally free riding on Americans to the point of, like America just having had enough?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a very complicated history, and different people will emphasize different things. The biggest thing to see from my perspective that are worth noting is that there is a change, of course. Right? The big thing everyone points to now is the aftermath of the Second World War. The Western European allies that benefit from the American liberation and are the kind of core members of NATO, obviously the economies are devastated and to some extent rebuilt by the Marshall Plan. And there's a certain, very understandable horror of anything that seems like nationalism or militarism after the destruction of the war. That's true. But between 1945 and 1990, the shift towards, if you will, butter, not guns, but in European fiscal policy was not so dramatic, right? People forget, but West Germany, the Bundeswehr, was the second largest NATO army. and actually, especially in armor, its tank divisions were very significant. But the second big shift, so if you will, kind of culturally, mentality-wise, I think World War II is one inflection point. But the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union is practically the big one, right? Where um, huge warehouses of arms and equipment were left to rot, essentially, since 1990. France was always an outlier, though, in the European trend, partly because of de Gaulle. De Gaulle insisted on removing France from unified NATO command, so France was a sort of associated NATO member, but not fully under joint generalship. The thought being it was beneath the dignity of a great country like France for American admirals and generals to be telling their troops where to go. And concomitantly, this meant there was serious investment in that era in core French defense capacities. So one interesting one is aircraft carriers, right? Very, very hard, obviously, and expensive to build and maintain. Carrier groups, the French still have one. And with the serious forward strike capacity, et cetera, one of the things that allowed, for instance, the French to intervene successfully successfully in a certain sense, militarily successfully, politically a failure in Libya in 2012 under Sarkozy. French special forces and counterterrorism have been kept at a high level.
Or
so
the Foreign Legion.
The Foreign Legion as well.
Submarine, aren't the French pretty...
The French have an independent nuclear deterrent through nuclear submarines. And all this is, interestingly, is de Gaulle's adaptation of his armored doctrines in the interwar years. So anyway, if your listeners know anything about de Gaulle's biography, he was one of the few who saw the weakness of the French army before the defeat in 1940, which was that although on paper it was large, many of its key capacities were defensively deployed, very static, very bureaucratic. Right? And he said what you need is a force de frappe. You need a strike force, which is flexible, responsive, can take the initiative, so that you're not passively waiting for the enemy to attack you and let them set the terms. So the nuclear deterrent and the naval capacities actually comes out of this doctrine of we shouldn't just have big, static, expensive things to maintain. We should actually be able to move flexibly and take the initiative in the world.
Yeah, and that's part of the strategic autonomy, right? It's the whole...
Yes, it's a key ingredient, yes. So another case, people forget, but the French forces in Afghanistan were significant and performed well. Operation Barkhane, started in 2014 under President Hollande, is French anti-Al-Qaeda and ISIS-aligned Islamist groups in West Africa. Also, again, a military success, but a kind of political defeat in the long run because the West African partner states resented it in the end. But those units have a good track record. But overall, yes, as you say, the growth of the state and kind of static expenses has started to weigh everything down.
Yeah, because if you think about the military as essential state capacity, right? The state needs capacity to be able to maintain that state capacity, right?
Yes.
It needs, and when so much of your revenue ends up going to welfare, for instance, eventually when you make budget choices, and we see it here a lot too, right? Basically, defense is the thing that goes.
It's easy to sacrifice, and
especially if you have the army, if you have the U.S. de facto providing.
Yes. So let me give you a couple data points that reflect that sclerosis, that complacency. 25% of the French annual budget is pensions, and a significant part of that is military pensions. France technically meets its 2% NATO spending obligations that the Trump administration has pushed heavily. But part of that, again, is paying retired soldiers, which doesn't really count towards actual military capacity.
Oh, I thought for whatever reason, I thought it was 5%, but it's just 2%.
The US's target now is 5%, but the previous the one set under the first Trump administration was 2%. And partly you do have, after the Russian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago, some genuine political will now to spend more or to try to spend more on defense capacity. But there again, that war has really revealed how bad things had gotten. The French sent 24 howitzers, mobile artillery pieces to Ukraine at the start of the war, that's 1/3 of the entire French artillery. Right? 24 guns should not be 1/3 of your capacity if you want to be a serious country. Right? So there are things like that that were really let to rot on the vine. Another interesting example, it came up in hearings in the French Senate. It was a minor scandal a year ago. The Charles de Gaulle, the working French aircraft carrier, which is sort of the pride of the fleet, was deployed in the Red Sea to fight to deter the Houthis and other pirate problems in the Red Sea that threaten commerce. And this tens of billions of dollar ship was sent out without enough ammunition for its anti-aircraft guns, meaning one cheap missile could damage or possibly even sink this floating fortress, right? Because basic maintenance wasn't being done. Right? And it's the kind of penny wise, pound foolish things of it looks easy to save, it's politically expedient, but could lead you to a national catastrophe. So far, it's been nothing. Well, the actual military threats have been terrorism, right? Have been internal threats. The Charlie Hebdo killings in 2015, the Bataclan, the Nice attack in 2016. The Macron government so far hasn't had a really horrifying story like that on its hands. But you can see how people are nervous. The French public is very nervous about terrorism.
Yeah, so the Bataclan was in 2015.
Yes.
And Charlie Hebdo was when?
Summer of 2015, a few months before the Bataclan. It was July versus November, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. And they were really just horrendous. And the Bataclan thing was particularly shocking because it was a coordinated attack at several locations in Paris, including
highly trained ISIS squads, right? And these are not amateurs.
The Bataclan, which is a concert venue, and where basically they opened fire on
killed more than 100 young people. Yeah. So these are not minor incidents, and I think any serious French defense policy has to take into account internal security as well, particularly given the large, very good research on this recently. It's hard to study well, but something like 20 to 30% of French Muslims sympathize with political Islam and would like to see more of it in their country. Right? So there's a, and depending how you ask the questions, it can be as high as 50, 60% and higher among young people. Right? So there is real internal Islamist sentiment, and because that also is not unrelated to terrorism.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt. It also because the economic sclerosis in France and the fact that it's had, like very low economic growth for a long time. And
0.6% annually is the general trend.
And also because the labor market being so rigid, and so as a result, unemployment being high, and it's people don't, like, companies don't want to really hire people because it's so hard to get rid of people. That foments like a lot of these issues. And in France, it is very, very, it's like quite problematic. And anyway, so.
Yeah, especially because, most recent immigration has been low skilled, and it's precisely those jobs that are actually very hard to come by.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
The migration policy in the 70s was started with the assumption that Renault and other big manufacturers would need lots of manual labor. But those are, those places closed or automated.
In part because the labor market is it's like the labor laws are so
indeed
just crazy, and it's just very, very hard to get rid of.
You had an influx of culturally and religiously distinct immigration at the very time when the economy was shifting and contracting.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a bad combination. But maybe if I can just say something about the last 10 years of politics to kind of bring us down in your question to the present. Macron was elected in 2017 in a very unusual way. And I think it's interesting for listeners maybe thinking about liberalism, its connection, its posture toward the left, its posture toward populism. Macron was in a certain way a liberal hero in 2017 because the socialists had been in power for 5 years. The National Rally, it's now called, it used to be the National Front under Marine Le Pen, was challenging for the presidency, a real serious candidacy. And Macron managed to create a third party, or a new party, or really like the fifth party, that split the difference, that persuaded enough of the people with capital that the currency would be stable. He shamed Le Pen for talking about a French exit from the Eurozone, and which obviously sparks worries about currency stability. But he also successfully framed the old socialists as weak and responsible for the
And
the terrorists.
and it's worth reminding people that he was the economic minister under Hollande, under the socialist
Yes,
candidate
yes.
before. And
So
I,
many of his ministers were former socialists. He's not a man of the right, certainly, but he
but he's much more. I don't have any love for Macron for a variety of reasons, in part because I think he's very authoritarian. But for a French president, he actually knows what good economic policies are. Whether he
yeah,
wants to do it or not, that's a whole other story. But
certainly, yeah. I mentioned the civil service training schools. He has an impeccable academic record, very highly trained in technical, economic, and fiscal policy questions. And he came in saying, I'm going to stabilize the currency. I'm going to control the debt. I'm not going to be like the irresponsible populists of right and left who want to spend too much. And in particular, I'm going to control pensions, which, as I mentioned, 25% of the French budget, growing every year, really make our American entitlement problems look small proportionally.
well, actually, in a way, I mean, it's kind of their system's still better. Ours is so crazy on the retirement front, where we give so much money to higher income retirees. Then,
Yes.
I mean, it's like I you know I it's just like our system is insane still.
No. Well, there are very serious problems with American entitlements, but I think one difference is that the median French voter feels entitled to a pension. Right?
Oh yeah.
It feels like it's my money personally in a way, whereas I think still for most Americans, Social Security and Medicare are kind of abstractions.
Unfortunately, not.
Which is
I mean,
perhaps,
and
yeah.
unfortunately, like each time I write about reforming these programs, I get like tons of email telling me, but you don't understand. This is my money. Like I paid for it my whole life. Why would we agree to any cuts? So it used to be the case, but a lot has changed, I think, unfortunately. But in France, it's just a sense of entitlement, and it's really hard. And I will give this to Macron. It's like, while his retirement reforms were baby reforms, right? He was very committed to doing some of it.
Well, this is the thing, and this is where I want to run through the past few years. The campaign promise was very central, for sure. The follow through has not been.
Yeah.
So the partly because he depended on the pensioner vote to beat Le Pen, and then you have essentially a rerun of the same election 5 years later in 2022. But in the meantime, what's happened? COVID and the public spending for the COVID response. So 2017, when he came into office, French debt to GDP ratio was 98.5%. It's now 115.5%. So a 17% increase. And my understanding is generally, fiscal experts would tell you 100% of debt GDP ratios where alarms start to go off, where the bond markets start to distrust you.
Well, I mean, in fact, it's been downgraded. Its debt has been downgraded several times.
Exactly. 98% was bad, but 116% almost is getting apocalyptic.
With the highest tax of the OECD. The highest tax.
And this was a president elected precisely to control this issue. Right? And so pension reform, he attempted to raise the age from 62 eligibility age to 62 to 64.
Yeah. And now they're coming back on it.
And they've reneged on the promise. Yeah, because politically, again, Macron has no party really. There's no grassroots infrastructure behind him. The party was just him and a few ex-cabinet ministers he managed to convert in 2017. So there's no staying power for this coalition really at a national level. And what the far left, La France Insoumise and allies, and the populist right, the Rassemblement National and allies, have the two biggest blocks in the parliament. Well, basically it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Yeah.
But with only a third of reliable votes,
Yeah.
Macron has given up on all of the fiscal stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was worse. It's like they pushed through the retirement age, left for 2 years at an enormous cost. They were like protests and all this. So they gave away most of the savings and hands out. And now they're going to scale it all back. So it's like they're going to end up in a worse place than they were before the
Yes.
reform.
Yes.
But so where does this leave us? So you wrote this article following Munich and Davos and Munich. And I thought, it was just a really great article because France is really kind of at a different place than most of the EU, in the EU. It has, I think, this kind of displaced kind of, and maybe not deserved sense of itself, as if it should be kind of catered to in a very particular way. And here comes Rubio. And at first, here comes Trump, like telling them a lot of things they, I think, need to hear in an absolutely horrendous way, being just,
including actual threat of force over Greenland.
yeah, I mean, just horrible. Like, I mean, it's like it's not just the form; it's just the tariffs. It's like he's more aggressive, our trading allies than our actual enemies. And then Munich. So can you tell us why you wrote this piece and what the case you're making?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. So the hope really when writing this was to offer both to Americans thinking about making our foreign policy and thinking about friends and peers in France and how they might hear the American rhetoric. I wanted to offer the best interpretation of what the American posture could be and of how the sort of the noblest response you could get from the French side.
Because the Rubio message was the same as the Trump one in a very different tone.
Well, so
yes and no, actually.
Arguably, right. The underlying motivation, I think, is the underlying overarching goal, let's say, is very similar, right? Which is, we want you, the Europeans, and in my case, I was talking particularly to the French, to take responsibility for your own affairs, particularly when it comes to conventional defense, right? When we're not talking about nuclear and kind of space level strategic capacity necessarily, but we're talking about Air Force, Army, Navy, but that involves not just, this is the crucial thing that I think a lot of policy analysis misses, right? That involves not just dollars and cents and bullets and guns. It involves culture. It involves mores, or the deeper attitudes behind what motivates people's political priorities, right? And Rubio, I think, what was so impressive, what he did was he was able to articulate what is it that unifies America and Europe, right? What are the common intellectual, spiritual, cultural sources that we share that mean that an alliance is not merely kind of a desperate backs to the wall, we have a common enemy, right? Which, there's a place for that in foreign affairs, right? But that's not real friendship. And so my argument was, if that's the goal, is to get to that kind of friendship, the Americans should expect some real pushback from the European side, right? And my example was the French National Rally has been interestingly quite unwilling to just take the Trump administration's line on things, right? They've expressed real reservations over Venezuela. They've pushed back over Greenland. And at the same time, I was saying, to the French and others, if you want to be taken seriously in Washington when you do that, which I think is basically healthy, you also need to put your own house in order. You need to do the hard work of self-government, which involves things like not just having free and fair elections, but also paying your debts and assessing, your commitments and saying, can we really pay for this over years to come? So the fiscal and military side of that is very, very important, and is not disconnected from things like thinking through immigration policy, thinking through national identity. What is it that actually provides continuity over time?
So let me ask you, here is the way I would kind of sum it up and tell me if I'm correct. In a way, what I heard Rubio say, first, I think it was kind of the first real attempt to kind of codify what a Trump doctrine is, if there is one. Let's put that, you know, um, at least to project at least one version of what this is like. But what I heard him say effectively is like, look, we're a family. We come from the same stock. We have strong bonds, not just historically, but for all sorts of reasons, because we have such shared. Um, we have a lot of things that families share, but we're tired of being the only adults and you behaving like children, and we need you to grow up because we just can't we just won't accept actually like a situation where you behave like children. So
Yes. Yes.
it means it's not saying let me tell you what you should be doing, but it's just like at least behave like an adult. Whoever you're going to be, it needs to be an adult so that that kind of in that family you're a reliable member of that family. It's kind of like the way I understood it.
A nice metaphor to use. I mean, my metaphor was friends versus flatterers, but you could
Yeah.
also say, do we want to be siblings, or do we want a parent-child relationship?
Yeah.
And there is something, I think, also implicitly in the speech, right? Something unnatural. America is a child of Europe, and
Yeah.
intellectually,
Yeah.
historically,
And you
to
start a
a large
piece with
extent,
that.
demographically. How it's not good when the young are being forced to take care of their elders who are dependent on them.
Yeah.
Right? There's something unnatural about that. And maybe for a few years at the end
Yeah.
at the end of life, but to plan your civilization that way is a bad idea. Yeah, and there's a metaphor there for the increasing dependence of a shrinking younger generation, or sorry, the indebtedness of those shrinking younger generation to paying for the retirements of elderly people
Yeah.
across the Western world.
But it's also
So
kind of
it's a
like
powerful metaphor, actually.
it's also like the I mean, it's the American also saying like you're making all these choices at our expenses. So it's
Yeah,
one thing, it's one thing if you're deciding, oh, this is how I want to live my life. I'm free to live my life the way I want, right? But can I still have access to your credit card? And and
yeah.
and that's kind of like the Americans are saying enough to that. Now, I think Trump's going way too far in the way it's like he's just a man, like the hostility.
Yeah.
At the same time, you know, I will say this. I don't know how you feel about this statement, but so often I go to France and I have a life here in the US that I would have never been able to have in France. And yet I meet so many French people who really think that here in America we're just a bunch of hicks.
Yeah.
Right? And that it translates, you see it, on the international stage where it's kind of like we're happy to rely on America, but look at those buffoons, right? And it's just like I've been trying to tell my French friends, you know, no matter what you think of what Trump is doing and the way he's reacting, right? I think you guys have poked the bear, and now he's going at it like a child and unleashing all his rage. But I think there was a lot of build up, kind of enough treating us like a bunch of hicks who have no culture worth mentioning. No, we're just a bunch of buffoon with guns and
So there's much I could say to that. I mean, one interesting dynamic to look at is through things like the classical education movement, through things like great books programs, the new initiatives at the state level for civic thought in universities. I would say also the growth and success of my own institution, Hillsdale. Americans have a real appetite for learning, grounding themselves in, benefiting from the riches of the Western philosophical and intellectual heritage, which sometimes creates odd situations where very sophisticated, highly educated, highly credentialed Europeans don't necessarily know their own sources the way that Americans who have this kind of this sense of affiliation, but slightly as outsiders, are sometimes now better versed. But you still get the old attitude. So during my time studying there, I met with a very erudite, very accomplished French classicist, and after a meeting, she asked me to send her my research. So I sent her a few articles, and she wrote back, "But these are all in English." And I said, "Well, yes, that's the language I work in, the language my teachers expect me to work in." And she said, "There are only 4 philosophical languages: Greek, Latin, German, and French." And she was probably in her 70s. That attitude is not quite as common nowadays, but it's still there. But the question is, I mean, who is a truer heir to Greece and Rome if one of the great Greco-Roman heritages is self-government? Maybe we're losing that here too. I think the kind of spending decisions we're making puts that in jeopardy. But at least there's an attempt to say, what does it take to be independent? And we would actually be stronger and happier if our friends were more independent than themselves.
Yeah.
Just like in your example of the family, right? If my brothers and sisters are making bad decisions at home, that's sort of their problem until the disorder at home flows out and affects me. And so, the beautiful, lovely version was said by Marco Rubio. J.D. Vance last year at Munich said things like, "We don't want Britain and France to become nuclear-armed Islamist powers," right? Which is grim and stark, but also makes sense, right? If we're in this close alliance and these countries have power, it matters to us what their outlook on the world is and who governs them.
The problem with the with the J.D. Vance speech is that that's not all that he said. And while he dropped some truth bomb on them, it's just he wasn't very diplomatic. And so, unfortunately, like the message, the very important message that he was also communicating was lost by with all the rest. And it's not that actually what he was doing wasn't, because a lot of what he was saying wasn't true, but the way it was delivered as I know, that's the MAGA style was.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fundamental principles of rhetoric is it doesn't matter if what you're saying is true if you don't say it in a way that your audience can hear it. And I think, to some extent, maybe the harsher, sterner way of speaking, creates the opportunity for Rubio to come along and be gentler and warmer. By contrast, maybe Rubio wouldn't have been listened to if he spoke alone. But at the same time, especially the timing, speaking right before the German elections in Munich,
he got a standing ovation,
to my mind,
right?
take the context into account enough.
He got a standing ovation.
Yes. No, but speaking about the Vance speech a year ago was right before the German elections.
But the Rubio got a standing ovation, which, in your opinion, is it that people were relieved about what they perceived as the new direction? Or do you think that they were, what were they responding to, you think?
I think a number of things. And there are different people in that room who have very different philosophies. So it's hard to speak one size fits all. But I would say at one level, it was just a very beautiful, eloquent speech. And I think people were moved. I do think the contrast really helped. I think the response was much warmer than it would have been if Vance hadn't gone first. And I think you're also at a slightly deeper level, there's a certain bemusement among some of the European political class, right? Because frankly, they don't read Plato and Cicero and Thomas Aquinas and the people that you mentioned, Dante by name, right? They don't necessarily actually view themselves as heirs to the things that Rubio made the markers of the common tradition, or not all of them. So I think some of them were probably confused, but maybe still begrudgingly impressed. But what you really have is the broader European dynamic is you have a real danger, I think, of a political class that's grown complacent, and a populism that is, a very understandable reaction, but often irresponsible. And to my mind, part of what I'm interested in doing in the speech, part of what I'd like to see part of what I want to achieve in the article and what I would hope to see more of is examples, European equivalents to Rubio, who can articulate the intellectual noble version that addresses populist concerns without giving in to bad populist policies. Right? And so part of what I was saying, in a way to Jordan Bardella, and who's going to be the RN's candidate a year from now, very likely, and has a very strong chance of winning, is, you don't frighten people about their savings. Don't make them think that French currency is going to be devalued again, right? You have to show that you're fiscally prudent and that you're worthy of the public trust. And populists are not always good at that.
Yep. No, I agree. Well, that's all the time we have, but I would love to have you back to talk, about how this is unfolding in a few months, if you're okay with that.
Sure, I'd be honored. I mean, I'm very nervous opining with current events because the world is in flux and things can change fast. So maybe I'll have egg on my face, but I'll be interested to talk about that too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.